Okay, so on to our next speaker. We are coming back into the room. It seemed to be like quoting Hamilton today. I'm fine with that. It's a great song. But there we go. Moving on. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Erik Jampa Andersson, who is the author of Unseen Beings: How We Forgot the World is More Than Human. Very recently, May 2023. Congrats. Great. Looks like what a new book to buy. And is a postgraduate student at Goldsmiths, University of London, where he specializes in environmental history. Told you there was a theme. And the history of medicine. His thesis focuses on Tibetan nature spirit paradigms at the intersection of ecology, mythology, religion, and health. Erik is a graduate of the Shangshung Institute School of Tibetan Medicine and teaches globally on Tibetan and Buddhist studies. He has been an avid reader of Tolkien's works for 25 years. Erik, welcome.
No, not yet. Oh, there we go. Fantastic. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to the Tolkien Society for having me here. This is truly a lifelong ambition coming to fruition, so thank you very much. I'm really excited to be able to, I should have a presentation. Fantastic. So like Will said, I have a background in Tibetan studies, Tibetan medicine, MA history, yada, yada, environmental history, Unseen Beings. Check it out. I do talk about Tolkien in it quite a bit, but in relation to some of these other topics that I'll be discussing today. My paper is the Akallabêth and the Anthropocene, myth, ecology, and the changing of the world. And I'm really interested in looking at how a critical analysis of the Akallabêth or Atlante, the downfall, can help us to clarify the social, ecological, and political dynamics of the so-called Anthropocene, which I'll talk about a little bit more explicitly in a moment. I'm interested in questions such as what is a fall in relation to an empire or civilization? When and how does it begin? How does it relate to power? And what similarities can be identified between the narratives of the Atlante and the Anthropocene? Before we get into these two particular stories, I want to talk a little bit about history and taking a historical approach to Tolkien's work. History is itself a very powerful form of storytelling, and historiography, the writing of history, is never a neutral process. There are always many dimensions and degrees of historiographic context, of meta-history, which I'll talk about in just a second, which are brought into the creation of history. And of course, we know that for Tolkien, taking a historical approach to storytelling was very much within his wheelhouse. He says, after his famous quote about disliking allegory, he says, "I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers." He goes on to say here in the foreword to the second edition of Lord of the Rings, that the ways in which a story germ uses the soil of experience are extremely complex. And this is very much true for the writer of history, just as true for the writing of history as it is for the writing of fiction. So with this in mind, because Tolkien's awareness of this dynamic was incredibly acute and very sophisticated, we can take his work as a source or a collection of historical sources. They're very much primed for historical interrogation on both an external and an internal layer. Of course, we can talk about Tolkien's own lived experience, his own authorial process, and the historiographic context of that. But he also constructed all of his primary and secondary sources within the legendarium as being armed with this historiographic context. So that's the external and the internal layers. With this, we can actually observe internal bias, we can observe guesswork, we can observe intentional falsification within the narratives themselves. We have Bilbo's falsification of his encounter with Gollum, and we can also see this in the narrativization of the Atlante. This also provides space for the potential presence of propaganda, which was mentioned earlier, and I love that because I really am quite interested in this idea of Elendil specifically as being a bit of a propagandist. Okay, so when looking at the actual sources that we're working with, there are three main primary sources that deal with the fall of Númenor directly. The first is the Fall of Númenor, which was composed in the 1930s along with The Lost Road. And I'll come back to what these are in a moment. The second came about 10 years later with the Drowning of Anadune, which was composed along with the Notion Club papers. Incredible work in and of itself. And the third is the Akallabêth proper, which was composed in the 1950s as part of the Silmarillion materials, composed largely after he had composed the appendices, where he worked out some of his chronological details and so on. I'll come back to those in a second. What Christopher Tolkien notes in Sauron Defeated pertaining to these three layers of historiography is that actually they aren't three drafts of the same story. They are indeed three different accounts of the Fall of Númenor. The first, according to Christopher Tolkien, being an Elvish tradition, so an Elvish account of the Atalante. The second being a Mannish tradition, a human tradition, and the third being a mixed Dunedainic tradition, which itself is based on the previous two accounts. You can see there's a lot of copying and pasting from these earlier histories. For that reason, I identify the Akallabêth proper as sort of a hybrid primary and secondary historical source. These also all approach the story in slightly different ways, in quite a few interesting dimensions. The first, the Fall of Númenor, along with the Lost Road proper, we can see really more primary culpability with Sauron and in the reign of Tarkalion Ar-Pharazôn. As the narrative, as new information is revealed over the course of Tolkien's life, though, it gets a bit more complex. We see with the Drowning of Anadune that actually there was quite a bit of corruption preceding Sauron coming to Númenor. Ar-Pharazôn had a bit more culpability. And by the time we get to the Akallabêth, and especially the appendices, we can see that actually Númenórean corruption and the fall of this empire began long before the 34th century of the Second Age, at least from the time of Tar-Kiryatan, Tar-Atanamir, but then we can go further back in the appendices to Tar-An-Kalime, Tar-Minastir, etc. The appendices, I argue, and then I have to move on to this because I'm not great at being succinct. The appendices are interesting because as opposed to these first three texts, which would have been composed around the end of the Second Age, beginning of the Third Age, the appendices were composed about 3,000 years later by either one of the hobbits, Gondorian scribes, someone at the end of the Third Age. So they were really acting as historians with the most data to work with. And for that reason, I argue, we have the most nuanced narrative and explanation of what happened in the Fall of Númenor. There are other works that we have to consult with, obviously, when looking at the fullness of the story of Númenor, in particular, these last three, Aldarion Arendis, The Mariner's Wife, A Description of the Island of Númenor, and related texts. All of these were composed around 1965, and the Tale of Tal Elmar, which we have a whole talk about in a little bit, so I won't dwell on that too much. But these are really interesting works for one, because as was noted earlier, The Mariner's Wife is the only history that we have that was composed in Númenor in its heyday. Everything else was composed later from, memories or chronicles that were found in the Gondorian archives, but that is our only sort of primary source from Númenor in the height of its empire. So let's talk about the Anthropocene for a moment, because this is a really important feature of my study of this story. The Anthropocene is also a narrative, it's a story. This term Anthropocene, the Epoch of Humans, was coined in the 1980s by Eugene Sturmer and really popularized in 2000 by Paul Crutzen to define a new epoch, a new geological epoch defined by changes in the fossil record, which is dominated by human activity. That's really typified by anthropogenic changes in the Earth's lithosphere, biosphere, atmosphere, and so on. But it's really a story that tells about the transformation of humans as this undifferentiated whole, the anthropos, into a geological force. We were once a mere species, so the story goes. Now we're a geological force. Out of nowhere, we've stumbled into geological agency. This is established empirically through changes in the fossil record, but it's not just a geological story. It has vast, wide, world-altering, demands world-altering consequences in our perceptions of ecology, history, nature, culture, freedom, and indeed what it means to be human. When we think about the Anthropocene, we usually think about these hockey stick graphs, which tell us the story about how in the mid-20th century, there was this great acceleration where, along with very interesting shifts in human behaviors, namely in regards to consumption and pollution, there were also very troubling changes in many different Earth systems. Along with this story comes a sort of suggestion that this all took place around the mid-20th century. And indeed, this is something that comes up a lot when we talk about the Anthropocene. This is a new thing. It's a modern phenomenon. Humans have never had this kind of impact on the world before. It's only right now. This isn't entirely true. When trying to find the golden spike of the Anthropocene, the beginning, the inception point, this is actually a very complicated endeavor and very contentious. There's a lot of debate about when the Anthropocene began. We could look at the great acceleration of the 20th century and say, well, it happened there because that's when everything started taking this really intense uptick. But actually, the great acceleration was just a continuation and an expansion of procedures and processes that were put in place during the Industrial Revolution. So we really have to look at the Industrial Revolution as a more reasonable starting point than the Great Acceleration. But then, of course, we have the Industrial Revolution was itself funded and built upon the processes that took place during, for instance, the long 16th century and the era of European colonization. So we have to go back a little further and look at European colonization as actually one of the first major examples of humans radically changing the earth. I always find it a bit interesting that we think about widespread global ecological consequences as a modern phenomenon. But if you look at the Americas that existed 600 years ago, they no longer exist. The entire flora and fauna, the humans that live there are entirely different. European colonists did in fact change the world actively for many hundreds of years. And of course, one could argue, as I do a bit in my book, that you can go even further back. You can look at roots in the classical era. You can even go all the way back to the agricultural revolution and the dawn of the Neolithic as potential starting points for this so-called Anthropocene. There are, of course, some things that the Anthropocene narrative leaves out. For instance, it isn't all humans that are doing this. It never has been all humans that were doing this. If you look at carbon dioxide emissions alone since the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority has come from the global north, 40% from the US, 29% from the EU, only 8% from the global south, including China and India. So representing the majority of human beings are contributing the least amount of carbon emissions. So this isn't actually a story about all humans. It's been argued that the Anthropocene narrative is a depoliticizing narrative, trying to get us to diffuse the responsibility and say, oh, it's just human nature, it's humans as a whole. But it isn't. It's a more nuanced political problem. It also imagines a past in which humans didn't have this kind of ecological impact. But in fact, humans have always been a part of nature. We comprise nature like everyone else, and we've always had an impact on it. It assumes a separation between human culture and non-human nature, and it reifies that, which is problematic. It also describes it as an accident or a shock. I like this term, which we find in the Akallabêth, or this phrase, in an hour unlooked for by men, because this is our idea of the Anthropocene, that, oh, we didn't mean to, and we didn't think this would happen. There's a lot more I can say here, but I'm gonna keep going on. So then we come to the Atlante, to the downfall and the changing of the earth. And of course, we all know the standard narrative of the Atlante. I won't recount it in any sort of long form, but essentially 3 houses of the Edain as well as the Druidine, important point, are given the island of Elena off the coast of Middle Earth. They go there, and at first they have a flourishing society. They become very advanced, but they become restless. The gods place a ban on them from approaching Valinor. They're okay with that for a minute, then they start to gain more power. Sauron rises. They call him to a very overbold parley. That goes poorly. Sauron convinces Ar-Pharazôn to sail Valinor. He does it. Númenor falls. Everything goes a bit poorly. And all of this, of course, occurs in an hour unlooked for by men. They had no way of knowing that this would happen. And indeed, in Númenor's early days, the Ruxoale, in case, in their early days, the Númenóreans they exhibited a great deal of wisdom and promise. We're told that relations between men and animals remain more friendly in Númenor than anywhere else in the world. Númenóreans didn't relate with non-human beings as mere resources for plundering and for exploitation. They related to them as other kinds of beings that they were in social relationship with. This includes obviously elves, but also other humans and other non-human beings and communities. It's interesting to note that even relations with rival predators in Númenor were socially negotiated. If they needed to hunt some animals which were, posing a problem, they gave them due warning, and they approached it as a kind of ritualized warfare. It wasn't exploitation, it wasn't ecocide, it was a social relationship. But of course, this changed, and it changes really, I would argue, at least no later than the 8th and 9th centuries SA, with the establishment of Vignalonde and other colonies. This was Aldarion's era, and this was indeed the beginning of the mass deforestation of Eriador, largely for the building of ships, which this is also what happened in Europe at the beginning of the colonial era. The once thriving Mediterranean woodlands were razed to the ground for the building of imperial fleets, which then went through the entire world, pillaging and stealing resources and also carting enslaved peoples around. So dispossession, displacement, and enslavement of indigenous peoples, these began in this era, no later. And by the 19th century, Númenor became a powerful colonial empire with devastating ecological and social impact in Middle-earth. Tolkien tells us by this time, at least, the shadow falls on Númenor. As Gerard Hines notes, and I really love this, as from the beginning of the seed of this Númenórean story versus what Tolkien ultimately completes over the course of his life, we can see that it becomes far more than the sudden breaking of a prohibition, and indeed turns into a study in the causes and consequences of human corruption. He also says elsewhere that victory was the herald of their downfall, and that the downfall is partly the result of an inner weakness in men, because reward on earth is indeed more dangerous for men than punishment, and the fall is merely achieved by the cunning of Sauron in exploiting this weakness. This is, in fact, a slightly different approach to the Akallabêth narrative than what we usually get. We are also, of course, told that more than Númenor changed in this process. The entire world was changed. According to the standard narrative, the once flat earth was made into a sphere, and all paths that once ran to the uttermost west now led nowhere but back again. I would also point out, and I know this is contentious, that this is in fact an internal falsehood, according to Tolkien. We know this from Myths Transformed, where he talks about his attempt to sort of make sense of the fact that actually the earth has always been round, so how can a myth tell this story and still have value? But he even speaks of it in The Drowning of Anadune, where he says that this story was actually told to the Númenóreans by Sauron as a manipulation to convince them that actually the earth isn't a closed circle. There are countless lands that you can go out and exploit. There are countless lands that you can go and claim. In later times, men, the Dunedain, etc., came to believe that the earth had only been made round by the gods in the time of the great downfall and was not thus before. I think this is quite similar to some of the ways that we think about and speak about the Anthropocene. We think that these changes have just happened. They've been very recent. It's only happening now, or maybe even in the future. But indeed, these changes, the changing of the world, has been occurring for many hundreds of years at least. In both our primary world histories and also in Tolkien's histories, it is valuable to pay attention to indigenous perspectives. They can provide a great deal of nuance to our understanding of apocalypse. We have to obviously acknowledge the fact that indigenous peoples and people of color have borne a great deal of the most dramatic consequences. They've dealt with the gravest ramifications of these processes historically, which has led Catherine Yusof to argue that actually we need to acknowledge either a billion Black Anthropocenes or none. And she says, quote, "There is a need to question moves to innocence, the claim that we failed to understand the violent repercussions of colonialism, industrialization, or capitalist modes of production, and that these violences were an unforeseen byproduct or excess of these practices and not a central tenet of them." I would say that this is very much applicable in the story of Númenor. Tolkien tells us that by the end of the Third Age, all but a few regarded study of what was left of Númenor's history as vain, breeding only useless regret. The story of Ar-Pharazôn and his impious armada was all that remained generally known in later days. This is, I think, where propaganda really comes into play. Of course, at the time that these narratives were being constructed, Sauron was still a major problem, arguably a greater problem than he had been historically for the peoples of Arnor and Gondor and these exiled kingdoms. So it makes a lot of sense to put the blame on him and to deflect a certain degree of responsibility from the Númenóreans themselves. We all, as far as the accounts of lesser men in the legendarian themselves, we have Tal Elmar's story and the affairs of the people of Agar, where they're told, you know, it is time, the men of the West have resolved to make this land our homes, and the folk of the dark must depart or be slain. I want to quickly point out that this whole concept of the folk of the dark, of the higher men, middle men, and lesser men, Tolkien explicitly states in the essay on dwarves and men in the peoples of Middle-earth, this was a taxonomy created by the Númenóreans. This wasn't bequeathed by the Valar. This wasn't put onto them by the elves. This was the Númenóreans themselves saying, well, we're the higher men. We are the top. We are the master identity, to use Val Plumwood's language. And then they determine, well, the middlemen are the ones that are kind of like us and that are friendly with us. And the lower men, those are the ones that they either don't look like us, explicitly according to Tolkien, they don't look like us, or they're unfriendly towards us. They don't like us. Even if we've destroyed their habitat, we've destroyed their homes, we've kicked them off of their lands, they don't like us, thus they're lower men. Very problematic. We also, of course, have the Druidine, who lived in Númenor with the other houses of the Edain, and were part of Tar Aldarion's household. And they told him, you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. They warned him explicitly that this is going to lead to devastating consequences. And did he listen? No, he didn't listen. He continued to go on with his colonial endeavors. So they left. They said, the Great Isle no longer feels sure under our feet. And they left. By the end of the Third Age, the peoples of Gon-Burigan, the Woses, were probably the last Druidanic society in Middle-earth. And even then, what do they ask Eomer and Theoden for when they help them through the forest on the way to Pelennor? Their whole request is just stop hunting us like animals. Stop hunting us like beasts. Let us live in the woods and maintain our lives. Those are the so-called middlemen and the higher men. Even at the end of the Third Age, they couldn't catch a break, and it wasn't all the orcs' fault. The last one I'll just point out is the Dunlendings, who were specifically kicked off of their land, and their land was given to the Rohirrim by the Dunedain. So, and that was by the faithful. So even to go back to this idea of propaganda, this separation that, well, the king's men were the bad ones and the faithful were the good ones, this isn't actually true. The faithful were also engaged in colonial processes and dispossession, displacement, exploitation. All of this can be found amongst them as well. I'm coming close to the end. Sorry, I know I'm probably over. This is what happens. From an indigenous point of view, I forgot his first name. Kyle Pois White. He writes that from an indigenous perspective, our climate emergency is really less about the specter of a new future, a coming apocalypse, and more like the experience of deja vu. Climate change and the destruction of lands, the changing of the world has already happened many, 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 many times. It's just hasn't necessarily been European societies that have faced the ramifications of it most directly until now and in the near future. For many, cataclysm is not a pending future possibility, but an existing trauma, and the Anthropocene has been intentionally cultivated by the powerful for the pursuit of human domination, for a noontide of man, much like the Númenóreans for many generations. In conclusion, we're approaching a conclusion. The story of the Akallabêth and the Anthropocene have countless similarities. They're both stories about the cataclysmic changing of the earth and the destruction of worlds. Both originally had respectful social relations with the more than human world, and that changed. Began with mass deforestation, building of ships to colonize other lands. Conquest is a part of that. Exploitation is a part of that. It quickly went from non-humans to other humans. Indigenous peoples were dispossessed, killed, and enslaved, etc. We can see that in both cases, cataclysm is framed as unprecedented and unforeseen in an hour unlooked for by men. And later histories have systematically whitewashed and sanitized our narratives of apocalypse to ignore colonial culpability in the changing of the earth. In actual almost conclusion, this is like the last slide, I promise. It's worth Okay, cool, thank you. It's worth pointing out that I love the motif of Isildur saving a last fruit from Nimloth, because the reality is that Isildur and Elendil were incapable of stopping Númenor from falling. Númenor had already fallen. I would argue that the cataclysm of the 34th century, that was not actually the moment of Númenor's fall. Númenor's fall took place over thousands of years. At this point, Isildur and Elendil were in no position to prevent a fall from happening. One could argue that the best thing that could happen from the perspective of many other beings of Middle-earth was for Númenor to fall, to actually fall into the ocean. So, but what he was able to do was to save a fruit from Nimloth. We may not be able in our own worlds to avert our fall, especially if it's already begun, but we can make a concerted effort to preserve whatever fruits are worth preserving and to allow for new growth to emerge in the cracks of a crumbling world. In actual conclusion, I would say that the great tragedy of the Atalante, as I said, is not Númenor's literal descent into the depths of the ocean, but rather its fall from a state of relational enchantment into paradigms of instrumentalism, exploitation, chauvinism, and so on. And it's clear that there are many similarities between these narratives, and I think that it's clear that Tolkien was well aware of this. The concept of the Anthropocene had not yet arisen when Tolkien passed away. So he wasn't speaking directly to this. It's not an allegory for it, but he was obviously very interested in the concept of the age of men and its correlation with a fall from a state of enchantment. In some ways, both of these stories, the Atalante and the Anthropocene, are both myths in a positive and a negative sense. The Anthropocene is in many ways a kind of morbid delusion, to use Tolkien's words, that obscures our understanding of the complexities of the past. But not all myths are delusive, and it may be that so-called fantasy holds the keys for both our destruction and our recovery, both in the sense of a recovery and renewal of health, and also the regaining of a clear view. Storytelling is not merely explanatory, it's generative. It's a world-making practice in and of itself. And I believe that dynamic and critical engagement with stories can help us better make sense of our own realities and help us to imagine new ways of being in a more than human world. Thank you very much.
Was anyone expecting that? That was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming and sharing such. And again, I find it really interesting that we seem to be taking quite a anti-anthro perspective consistently. It gives kind of like time back to like the speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, to deplace the human perspective. So it's fantastic to really have a really geared approach in that sense to question the Anthropocene. Thank you. Okay, let's go to some questions. Wait, I need to ask.
Thank you so much. Just a remark about all the racism or gradation by Númenor. They had a good example with the elves. Absolutely. Before that.
Absolutely.
That's, I mean, they did not invent the concept. The elves did in the first age.
Absolutely.
I'm quite interested because it goes back to Sarah's presentation as well. I really like now it's a bit old-fashioned, but in Dumézil's studies of human societies, and he has an argument that the problems in Europe might have begun when Rome took over with a model of society where state was first and the temporal power didn't have to answer to any superior power and could develop a lot of pride and a sense of their own superiority. And I think if we try to trace back the problems that are leading us to where we are now, and as we saw with Sarah's presentation, it was the same in Númenor. The moment they stopped taking into account a superior power, morals, however you want to call it, and think that the human power is paramount and gives them rights over everything else. And I think it's a fascinating parallel that maybe can give the source of it all.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, you know, because if you have the perception of a supreme power that is telling you are the most important beings within your environment and you have the right to do whatever you want with everyone, then that concept does nothing positive for us. That itself becomes the root of corruption and destruction, which I think in our own primary world histories had a big part to play in this, along with this construction of anthropocentrism, which we can look back to ancient Greece, we can look at Plato and Aristotle with the construction of the rational human soul and this idea that humans alone are the only sentient conscious beings in the entire universe, which is absolutely ludicrous, but then also not stopping at human. It's this construction of many forms of master identity complexes where actually it's only men, or it's only the men of Athens, or only the free men of Athens, just dealing with Aristotle himself. So this concept that this is how the world works is you can break everyone up into groups, and then you can arrange those groups into a hierarchy, and whoever's on the top gets to call the shots. I think that has been philosophical methamphetamine, essentially, in our approach to engagement with the world.
Super, thank you. Okay, we do have a bit of a backlog of online questions, so this one seems to have sparked a few. Okay, so Erik, how much do you think Tolkien was distancing the Númenórean taxonomy of high, middle, and low from his own anthropology? Did Númenor disturb the Earth disproportionately at the global north, as the global north did in our timeline?
Can you repeat the question?
Of course I can. How much do you think Tolkien was distancing the Númenórean taxonomy of high, middle, and low from his own anthropology? Did Númenor disturb the Earth disproportionately as the global north did in our timeline?
I think it would be not to the same extent. I mean, in the first 100 years of European colonization of the Americas, over 50 million indigenous Americans were killed in the first 100 years of the colonization of the Americas. So we absolutely cannot compare what the Númenóreans did to what European colonists did in terms of scale. I don't know how much he was interested in actually distancing this sort of the construction of this hierarchical taxonomy in the Númenórean system. I don't think he was intending for this to be an allegory, but I do think that he was absolutely speaking to some of these fundamental problems that we've dealt with perennially over the course of at least the past 2,500 years, and indeed probably much longer. I think he was very much aware of these dynamics. Obviously, he had an eco-critical approach to things, and he was hyper aware of the links between the destruction of the environment and a fall from enchantment into paradigms of oppression and colonization and so on. I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, but I think he was pretty overt about this. I think realistically what he was constructing is the legendarium, and my perspective is that it was sort of revealed through him in the sense that he experienced it as it is, and this is what we have. His commentarial sort of layer is, I think, a step removed. But he does explain explicitly that it was the Númenóreans that constructed this whole idea for themselves of how to arrange their taxonomy, with the example of the elves, certainly. But the elves didn't make their taxonomy based strictly on how people looked or whether they were friendly to one another. There were different sorts of standards. The Númenóreans did that directly. And I do think that he was hyper aware of the fact that from early Númenor, where they had respectful social relations with many other kinds of beings, human and non-human, all the way to the destruction of Númenor and the post-fall, sort of post-apocalyptic world that they created, that was quite a fall. It was quite a, grave, perilous descent. I don't know if I answered the question. Sorry, feel free to email me if you want to chat about the question.
I think you did share your email on your slides, didn't you?
I didn't on the slide.
Not on the slides?
No.
Okay.
I'm not difficult to find. You can find me on lots of things.
You've got a website?
Yeah, I have a website, srimala.com, erikjampa.com. As long as you spell my name correctly, then you'll get there.
Suddenly you've got 10,000 views.
Fantastic.
New views, I should say. Okay, back to the room. Do we have another?
Thank you so much. And I'll just begin by echoing what Will said. This was a phenomenal paper and so many interesting points, but I'm just going to ask you about the one thing that just really jumped out at me, partly because I'm from the United States and our political situation has been so difficult lately. But you talked about how later times came to see the study of the story of Númenor as
Yeah.
something that would breed only useless regret.
Yeah,
And I'm hearing that echoed in the political climate in the US, that studying our racial past just makes white
absolutely.
children feel bad. And so we shouldn't do
Exactly.
that, right? I was
Yeah.
just so struck by that parallel. I wondered if you could comment on it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that is precisely what Yusuf is talking about with moves to innocence. I mean, that is specifically in relation to our colonial past and to the ways that we have contributed to the changing world that we now live in. But it is very applicable with all of this racism and, I mean, institutional racism, you know, slavery, enslavement of Black peoples especially, that these are all interlinked with colonization, which is directly linked to climate change, to the changing of the climate. So these are all, you know, a big part of the same question. But absolutely, this is precisely what we're seeing in the United States right now, with places explicitly banning any sort of discussion of America's past, you know, past history of enslavement and current, you know, paradigms of institutional racism for precisely this reason. Because why worry about the past? It's just going to bring useless regret. And in this case, they had a perfect scapegoat to point to that was very pragmatic for the peoples at the end of the Second Age and again at the end of the Third Age to say, well, it's that guy that we're trying to fight anyway. He's the one that caused all of this. It wasn't us. We don't need to worry about that. What's done is done, but he's still here and we can go after it. And I don't necessarily think we have that scapegoat. There are scapegoats that have been provided by certain political entities in places like the US, but it's not a unanimous sort of thing the same way that Sauron is very obviously a clear scapegoat. But yeah, I think there's very obvious similarities between them. And we have to be very careful of that. And Tolkien, obviously, or whoever, you know, whoever wrote what he writes there in Unfinished Tales was a bit critical of that, you know, people only worried about Ar-Pharazôn and worried about Sauron. It was just in the 33rd, 34th centuries that things went awry. But that's not true at all. Yeah, precisely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much. Yet again, these really detailed oriented answers. It feels like choosing Númenor was the right thing to do almost.
Absolutely.
Like we've had such in-depth discussions just in the Q&A. Maybe like we should expand it to like 15-minute Q&As in future.